Okay, so you mentioned an individual who was in charge of the Global Engagement Center. This in 2014 when this happened, that was during the Obama administration. Who individually or what organization is primarily behind this effort to create a censorship apparatus in our government?
Well, it's still the U.S. State Department, but there's several nodes for it. So first of all, you have several nodes at state. The Global Engagement Center is still around. What they've done is they've delegated much of this to USAID's Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance apparatus. Now, it's important for folks to understand USAID is not an aid organization. Do not be fooled by the name. It is the Agency for International Development, not aid. And its goal is to internationally develop assets for the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency to use to advance our foreign policy goals. For example, if we want to acquire resources or extract resources from a certain region, if we want a military base in a certain region, if we want a certain region to vote a certain way at the UN, if we want to expand private enterprise, or if we want cheap labor markets, if we want export markets for our own goods and services, we need to develop political vassalage control over foreign countries' governments, or at least an influence mechanism to influence the course of events inside foreign countries. And so in order to do that, you need institutions on the ground in that country who are able to effectively take control over that government or exercise influence on it. Those capacities have to be capacity built with money, with training, with resources, with personnel. And that is the role of USAID. It is to capacity build those institutions, to fund them. Now, USAID gets $50 billion a year. And the thing that they have pivoted hardest to in the past 5 years has been the creation of censorship institutions in foreign countries in order to move forward censorship legislation and censorship activity in those countries. So, for example, it played a massive role in the Brazil censorship story that targeted Elon Musk. It was USAID which capacity built a network of hundreds of different indigenous Brazilian institutions, Brazilian universities, Brazilian newspapers, Brazilian fact-checking organizations, Brazilian judiciary clerks, Brazilian parliamentarians, Brazilian prosecutors, all to push anti-misinformation bills at the national parliament level, anti-misinformation prosecutions at the legal level, anti-misinformation sort of inflaming it as a sociocultural issue in Brazil, and working directly with the TSE censorship court with de Moraes, the Voldemort, Chief Justice of the censorship court there, in order to kill the ability to host pro-Bolsonaro content on Facebook, YouTube, X, as well as Telegram and WhatsApp. That all came from USAID, the department. It's the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance thing. That is the main money node for all of this. And on the domestic side, there's the National Science Foundation, which provides over $100 million under the Biden administration to American university centers. They'll call them disinformation labs or disinformation studies research. That is a lie. They're censorship operations, active censorship operations disguised as passive disinformation research in order to kill the rise of political populist movements like Donald Trump here in the U.S. or those of his perceived allies internationally, from here to Brazil to Western Europe, all the way into Hungary and beyond. And so there are all of these different centers. I mean, again, National Science Foundation, DARPA, state, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy. You have at the university level, you have over 100 U.S. universities who get funding from the Pentagon and the State Department and the NSF to do this. You also have thousands of NGOs, GONGOs, government-organized, government-funded, non-governmental organizations who serve as pawns on the State Department's chessboard in order to get things like the EU Digital Services Act passed, this major Europe-wide censorship law that is threatening to carve up Elon Musk's entire portfolio of corporate assets if he does not censor effectively what NATO tells him to censor, including those political groups that I just mentioned. So the issue is because all of these are parked nominally in their different silos, state, DOD, NSF, USAID, they're having to do a clumsy consensus building process now, which is that they all meet at the Atlantic Council. They all meet at Brookings. They all meet at the Aspen Institute. They have these big stakeholder conferences. They'll fly 200 people to London. They'll spend 3 days there, and they'll talk about what the initiatives are, what the branding terms, what the targets are, and then they all go back. They meet. They continue to trade white papers, but it's a clumsy, slow process, and they want to be able to do it instantly in real time, so that no one on the other side has a chance to access hearts and minds in order to oppose them. And that's their current struggle is the centralization process.
So what we're going to face here then is, even though this ostensibly, whether it's state or whether it's US aid, those are supposed to be organizations that work outside of the United States. It's not supposed to be here domestically that those agencies are used against us or against anything really. But what's going to happen is they're going to be turned against us because they're going to use as justification for being used domestically this false accusation that, oh, we're just Russian assets, for example. You're just parroting talking points that Vladimir Putin wants to use to influence the election, and that's cheating. And so they're going to use it domestically under the justification of it being foreign propaganda that they're stopping. But I mean, how bad do you foresee this being? I mean, right now, whether it's on YouTube, we face a ton of censorship. You talk about COVID, you talk about transgenderism, you talk about election integrity, you talk about anything that kind of contradicts, quote unquote, the experts. And I mean, I don't have to tell you this. You get suffocated algorithmically, you get demonetized, you get strikes against your channel, you get booted outright. What is that going to look like if this is taken to the next step, and that power that you describe is actually centralized?
Well, it's going to look like there's no quarter for it, and that's been disrupted by Elon Musk's acquisition of X and by Mark Zuckerberg's turn against some of this. They were talking about this a year ago, that Mark Zuckerberg had already fired many of the, quote, relationships it took us years to develop. I posted a video on my X channel. It's at Mike Ben Cyber, of 5 of the top heavyweights in the censorship industry in September 2023, who were talking about how Zuckerberg, while everyone was talking about Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg was sort of taking cover in the free speech movement around that to fire many of the sort of CIA intermediaries, State Department relationships that had been developed over the course of years in order to have a pliable liaison within Facebook or Instagram that would censor whatever the State Department wanted them to. And so, they have this new issue, which is that this whole thing relied on this connective tissue between the big national security state and the big tech companies that was created through carrots and sticks, essentially rewarding them with favors from the State Department, fighting for them against international laws, preserving their foreign markets abroad, and by threatening them with regulation, with breaking them up, and with not fighting for them unless they did the censorship. But then you had a principles-based breakthrough with Elon Musk, who said, fine, bankrupt the company. The world will watch, but this is a free speech zone now. And then you have Mark Zuckerberg, who's remonetizing a lot of accounts that had been demonetized, and is making some pretty breakthrough progress. Even just last week, the oversight committee at the oversight board at Meta basically apologized and censured itself for having censored memes that made fun of Kamala Harris. This is the sort of thing that was unthinkable a year or two ago, but is now happening effectively on the daily. And so what they're doing now is they're using this apparatus to coerce the censorship using laws, so that no matter what happens politically, no matter what kind of scandal, no matter if they can't get the liaison tentacles inside the company will be required to, under rule of law. And this is what the USAID program, Democracy, Human Rights, and Rule of Law, is about. It's about creating censorship laws in 140 countries. They have a program there which targets to do this in 140 countries in order to redefine what it means to be a State Department compliant democracy in good standing, which is a concept they call digital democracy, which is this idea that whereas from 100 years ago up until 7 years ago, democracy meant freedom of speech. But now you don't have a resilient democracy unless you have anti-misinformation laws in place. And so what they're doing is they're funding judicial activists, they're funding lawyers, they're funding prosecutors, they're funding universities, they're funding media organizations to pass censorship laws in every other country, so there's no quarter for Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg to try to avoid the censorship of the State Department's opponents.
It's terrifying, but I'm actually glad you brought up Mark Zuckerberg, because I wanted to ask you about him and about Jeff Bezos, owner of Amazon, owner of the Washington Post. We all obviously have been following, me, I follow it kind of laughingly. I think it's funny what's happening at Washington Post when they, as a newspaper, declined to endorse a presidential candidate for the first time. This is Jeff Bezos' direction, and their staff just went ballistic, and their readership. Multiple writers for the Washington Post resigned over that. I think something like 200,000 subscribers unsubscribed. I think that was 8% of their total subscription base. So just an absolutely unreal number. What you predicted this, by the way. You were maybe one of the only people that, I think, was it last year? You can tell me the exact date. You said, keep an eye on Jeff Bezos because I think that he's being red-pilled. This is someone who has hobnobbed with the most powerful leftists and globalists around the world. So it's somewhat stunning to see. I don't know how much he's red-pilled. I don't know his motivation for it, but give me your analysis of both he and Mark Zuckerberg. These were very powerful players in the pockets of leftists. What is causing this change, and how much do you think it's going to impact what's going on politically in our country?
And remember, this is not an uncommon story for billionaires or oligarchs to go through this process where they are sort of inside the machine, working with it for years. And then over the process of time, they become disenchanted or isolated, or they feel that they're getting run over despite having been sort of good global citizens for it. You can argue that Elon Musk went through a similar transformation. Elon Musk was a major military and effectively an intelligence contractor. When I was at the State Department, SpaceX had a big role, big seat at the table when it came to all things telecom. Elon Musk effectively was able to start SpaceX because of the CIA and State Department working to get him, the necessary, rocket technology. You had the State Department and CIA effectively overthrow the government of Bolivia several years ago to get access to the lithium, in part because lithium is one of the two major components, along with cobalt and several other resources, for the Tesla green, the renewable battery technology that made America sort of the best in class in terms of the renewable battery promise of the electricity revolution. And Elon was touted as a sort of left-wing hero because of his technological breakthroughs that would allow a green revolution to be built on some of this technology that he's done. But I think he became disenchanted through a number of things, his own sort of classical liberal beliefs in free speech. And then, from what he said publicly, what happened to one of his children around the transgender agenda, I think really changed his life. I think for Jeff Bezos, much of this started happening around the unionization process at Amazon. Amazon was in a knockdown, drag-out fight with the left-wing labor forces trying to unionize Amazon factory warehouses. And Bezos, despite siding with the Democrats for a very, very long time, the Democrats, I think he felt, betrayed them by siding with the unions and trying to force Amazon into these collective bargaining agreements because all the major unions are giant Democrat Party donors. Actually, a similar thing happened with Elon Musk and the United Auto Workers Union, the UAW, who I should note works closely with the CIA abroad. But maybe a story for another time. But what I'm getting at here is around that time, Jeff Bezos, it came out publicly that he had been actually reading right-wing, sort of new right literature. Many of the publications that I believe are either funded or associated with Peter Thiel that were sort of rising in popularity on social media. There was a Vanity Fair piece about Jeff Bezos, about this group, and Jeff Bezos put on his personal Twitter about a year and a half ago that he found this article to be very interesting, very eye-opening. He hadn't seen things like that before. And when somebody in the thick of a management versus labor battle puts publicly, Jeff Bezos only has one tweet on his entire Twitter account this whole year, by the way, and it was right after Donald Trump got shot in the face in Butler, Pennsylvania, and he basically wished the president good health. I mean, that speaks that should say something by itself. He has one
And
tweet all
praised
year,
him.
and it's
And
what's
praised him.
that?
He
Right.
praised him. He called him either courageous or stalwart, or he conveyed that he was impressed with Donald Trump's reaction to having been shot. It was a
Right.
very complimentary tweet.
He also personally moved from Bill Gates's Seattle to Miami. Miami is now a red city. I will tell you, living here, and also in terms of, I think all the official polling. I think it was actually in 2022 in the midterms, Miami-Dade turned red for the first time in its history. But the guy moved his whole life from Seattle to Miami. He's everything that he's published on his own X account suggests that he's become legitimately right-wing in the past 3 years. Everything in his own personal experience dealing with the Democrat establishment, it's obvious that he's been disenchanted by that. And then you have the fact that he just published this, in addition to stopping the endorsement at the WAPO level. He personally published an op-ed this week in the Washington Post saying, one of the delivering probably like the harshest medicine you could serve to a journalist or a journalistic institution, which was saying the problem is not them. The problem is not the American people. The problem is actually us, the news media. We've lost their trust, and it's not their fault for not believing us. We're actually not doing a good job as journalists. And so that self-reflection, that came after all of the mass unsubscriptions that you mentioned, although some of those, I should note, just as a last salvo here, are quite funny. For example, on day one, the editor-at-large of the Washington Post resigned and was held up as this, sort of martyr figure, and everyone should follow his lead. And that was the headline: Washington Post editor-at-large, resigns in outrage over Jeff Bezos' betrayal. But they never really emphasized the guy's name or what he was doing. That was Robert Kagan, who resigned, the Washington Post editor-at-large. Who is Robert Kagan? He's the husband of Victoria Nuland. Victoria Nuland's husband, Robert Kagan, was the editor-at-large at the Washington Post. Victoria Nuland is NATO's angel of death. She was the U.S. ambassador to NATO, and then she became the assistant secretary for Europe and Eurasia at the State Department. So she oversaw about 20 different elections every election cycle, and her job as the manager of the State Department's global chessboard of assets is to ensure the correct party wins and loses every single election, and if the wrong party wins, to orchestrate a color revolution to oust that democratically elected government and install a State Department puppet. Basically, in the name of democracy, usurping democracy on every single country covered in her assistant secretary portfolio. I should note that she actually, when she left the State Department, what is she doing now? Well, now she's a board member at the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the #1 CIA cutout in the entire swarm army of the Central Intelligence Agency. That agency that she just joined was actually created by the CIA director Bill Casey in 1983 when they tried to get the CIA powers back that they had lost under the Church Committee hearings. So it's one big club.
It's also very telling about how right. It's very telling about how effective the mainstream media are as the propaganda arms of the left. If the husband of a woman who not only rigs elections abroad, but stages color revolutions, as you said, usurping democracy, if her husband resigned, then he must think it's a pretty big deal that that Jeff Bezos, through the Washington Post, is not walking in lockstep anymore with Kamala Harris. That must mean it's a pretty destructive thing that they're facing for their agenda.
It's huge to them, and you can see why. But I should note, I do think this is much bigger than left. I think when it comes to for example, the Bezos union fight, I think that's a fair characterization to say that that's a left-wing thing. Or when he's reading the Vanity Fair piece about the new right and he's getting interested in conservative literature, I think that's correct. That's a left-right thing. But in this case with Robert Kagan has always been known as a neocon, as part of the sort of Bill Kristol. These are, yeah, right. I don't think Robert Kagan is woke, for example. I think that he signs on with the left when it comes to fighting Trumpism because of foreign policy. But in a sense, this is actually as bad as the left-wing wokeism, as bad as left-wing economics, can be. There's a force more powerful than that. And that is this blob permanent Washington apparatus, which can wield the Pentagon and the CIA and the NSA and DARPA and the State Department and USAID and tens of thousands of institutional assets across the media and civil society and the universities and the private sector firms in order to create this swarm attack on a political opponent. And that's what Robert Kagan is really tied into there. And what makes what we're up against so terrifying is that this goes to something deeper than the simple traditional partisan thummy war that happens every 4 years. What we're confronting is at the very sort of center of the inner atrium of the heart of what typically makes American power.